Thank you to everyone for joining Ideas 42 for the newest installment of our Academy Insights series. My name is Mitra Salasel. I'm the Director of Communications at Ideas 42, and I'm excited to see what looks like a lot of new digital faces here today. And today we're going to be talking about something that's extremely salient in this time. I'm joined by Vice President at Ideas 42, Omar Parbu, who's from our civic engagement team, and he's going to be talking about protecting our democracy in the time of COVID-19. So before I hand it over to Omar, I'm just going to talk a little bit for everyone that's new about some housekeeping around how this is going to work. Omar is going to present the topic at hand, and at the end of his presentation, we're going to be taking some questions. You'll notice that you're all muted, so please, as they come up, place your questions in the chat function in your Zoom browser, and then there will be some time at the end of the presentation for us to read them to Omar, and he will answer them as time allows. So we won't be doing any hand raising or live question and answers. So as the questions come up, please drop them into the chat box, and like I said, we'll answer them towards the end. And other than that, I will kick it over to Omar.
Thank you, Mitra. All right, let me share my screen. Hopefully without any issue. All right, Mitra, can you see my screen? Perfect. I'm assuming everyone else can. So let me echo what Mitra said and thank everyone for joining today. And now, like she mentioned, this is clearly a timely and important topic. So I'm glad to be discussing it with all of you. And hopefully what I'll cover today will add a unique perspective on the situation our country is facing and provide some ideas on what we can do to help protect our democracy come November. So just to preview what's to come today, I first want to briefly share a little bit about who we are and what we're doing around voting. And then I want to talk about how the pandemic has changed the landscape and shifted our priorities and our work. Finally, I plan to spend the majority of the time today talking through insights on how to help people transition to new approaches to voting and the role that smart behavioral design can play during this election year. As Mitra mentioned, there'll be time for Q&A at the end, so I welcome your feedback and questions then. All right, so who are we? Our nonpartisan Voting Innovation Lab was set up to better understand why millions of Americans don't participate in our elections. We do this by applying a behavioral lens to examine the psychological, environmental and policy barriers people face, and then design solutions to improve the voting context for more Americans. And all of this is in service of our twin goals. One is to substantially and sustainably increase turnout, and also to improve representativeness. Like many others, we want to support a broad, active electorate that looks like the country as a whole. And we have a very talented team that is dedicated to this work, and I'm very honored to be representing them today. So how big is the problem that we're tackling? So some of you may have seen this map before, but I think it says it all. Basically, if non-voters in 2016 were counted as a vote for nobody, nobody would have won more districts than Clinton or Trump and would have handily won the Electoral College. So this stark visual is not only a good reminder of how big the problem is, but a good reminder of why we can't rely solely on campaigns and partisan groups to change voting in this country. For them, winning or losing depends on relatively small number of votes going one way or another. So they don't necessarily have the motivation to activate voters at a scale that's commensurate with the problem. That's why broader democracy strengthening measures are so important to expanding the electorate. But as I mentioned, it's not only about turnout. We also need proper representativeness. And because when we don't, we have a distorted democracy. Policies become at odds with public sentiment. Communities are overlooked and underserved, and accountability of officials frays. This creates a vicious cycle where people feel even more disconnected from politics and lose their trust in our institutions. And those who are in positions of power are emboldened to enact a growing number of suppression tactics. But how do we get here to begin with? What kicked it off? Well, the basic question I'm asking is why don't people vote? For us, there are two dimensions we focus on to explain why people don't cast a ballot. First, for many, voting is not easy. There can be many steps in the process. Information can be hard to find. The timing may be off. And on the more nefarious side of things, barriers may be put up to make voting harder for people, like having ID requirements or purging voter rolls. But being easy is not enough. The second dimension that we focus on is that for many, voting is not meaningful. They may feel like their vote doesn't matter, that on-the-ground realities don't change, that no one will care if they don't vote. Fortunately, behavioral science can help us unpack and address a lot of these barriers. But now, with COVID, we have to contend with a third dimension, i.e. voting is not safe. There's a lot of attention on people who are thinking twice about voting due to concerns about their health. This was supposed to be a high turnout year, but we may end up with record lows instead. Even if people do show up, though, we shouldn't force voters to choose between their health and their right to vote. The recent Wisconsin primary should give us pause. Turnout proved to be relatively decent for a primary. It was on the same levels as previous years. But that was because people, despite the risks, showed up. Tens of thousands of voters crowded into a very limited number of polling places. I think we can do better. Specifically, I think states need to expand flexible voting options like mail balloting and drop boxes, and at the same time, they have to keep enough polling places open. But it's important that stringent safety protocols are put into place to protect voters. So the logistics of this shift to more options, just to be frank, is nightmarish, and I don't envy the position of a lot of election administrators. It's a tall task. New systems will be put in place with extremely condensed timelines, and the margin for error is basically zero. But beyond the logistics, voters are going to be asked to change how they cast a ballot without much of an acclimation period. Millions of people will find the process unfamiliar, and the transition will likely not be smooth. We only have to look to our recent history for a cautionary tale. Our public health response to COVID-19 offers an important case study for what we can expect. Even with a lot of guidance coming out, it took a while for many people to practice proper social distancing techniques and take other precautionary measures. A lot of the behaviors were unfamiliar, like staying 6 feet apart. And messaging was not always consistent. I mean, remember when we were told not to wear masks? Now when I pass somebody with a face mask, I make a big show of going around them in the hopes of shaming them. It's a little petty, but that's what I feel like I need to do these days. But there's room to help people along with consistent messaging and good designs. I think this restaurateur in Ocean City has the right idea. Let's see, just to show you what they came up with. Basically, forcing people to get into these inner tubes to stay distant from each other. Not sure if it's a scalable solution, but I think it's a clever way of solving the problem. So taking it back to voters, there are unique challenges to our current situation that could undermine the broad and representative turnout that we want. So to mitigate those impacts, we're focused on 3 objectives that are core to protecting the integrity of our democracy. The first is staying true to our core mission and using our tools to increase turnout even in these difficult times. So we're finding ways to activate voters despite the additional hurdles in place. The second is building confidence in our elections. As massive changes are made, voters' trust in the systems cannot be taken for granted. We need to proactively cultivate their belief that the vote is being conducted fairly and securely. Otherwise, we may very well find ourselves in a new crisis in which a sizable number of Americans reject the legitimacy of the results of the election. We need to make sure voters believe that their vote is being counted properly. And more importantly, we need to make sure that they believe that all votes are being counted properly. I have to admit, I stay up at night worrying about scenarios where we fail to do this properly and our democracy falls apart. It may feel hyperbolic, but I think it's something we have to contend with. So then moving on to the last objective, we also need to continue to work towards equity and inclusion in our electorate. As election officials implement new approaches to voting, millions of voters can be left out, so we need to design ways to broaden access for all. Let me start with voter engagement and unpack that a bit. So I want to return to the three dimensions for why we believe people do or do not vote, and think about them through the lens of COVID-19. When we think about ease, we now have to simplify new and safe approaches to voting. We have to think about how do voters think about voting in this new reality. When we look at whether voting is meaningful to an individual, we now have to recognize that expectations may have changed. With all the factors at play, does voting seem as urgent? Finally, when thinking about safety, how do we reasonably minimize risk in this unprecedented public health crisis? And how do we get more people to adopt the safest voting options like mail balloting? But before we answer those questions, as a way of setting the baseline, I want to quiz all of you on how Americans vote. Let me see. Mitra, would you be able to kick off this poll? Actually, I realize that as I'm in presentation mode, I'm not able to do it.
Sure.
Maybe not. Okay. There we go. Mm-hmm. So what percentage of ballots cast in 2016 were by mail? I love the confidence with which people are making their selections. This is good.
It's great turnout.
Yeah. If only all elections were this this good turnout. Okay, I think maybe we got all the votes we're going to get. Would you mind sharing the results? Oh, maybe there's still people coming in.
Okay.
All right, so the winner, according to the audience, is 13.2%. Well, in fact, it is closer to 23.6% if you consider everybody who voted by absentee ballot or mail balloting in states that offer that as the primary choice. Thank you, Mitra. So let me ask another question. What percentage of ballots cast in 2016 were through early voting? Would you mind putting that poll in place? Thank you.
Just give it a couple more seconds.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Great.
Great.
Okay, so the crowd has it. It is 17.2%. That is correct. So 17.2% of people showed up to polls before Election Day to cast a ballot. Thank you. Thank you, Mitra. So I appreciate all of you indulging me with that short quiz. But the reality I want to highlight through those questions is that more than 2 out of 5 voters voted through what we call non-traditional methods. But unfortunately, the aggregated numbers don't tell the complete story. There's a lot of variation across states. While people in Oregon are all mailing in their votes, only about 3.4% of voters are in Alabama. So across all types of voting policies, we see a lot of difference between jurisdictions. This means some states have a much higher hill to climb to get ready for November, but also that some voters will have to do more to adapt than others. Okay, so for many voters, the process of voting will include new and unfamiliar steps. If you look at the top line on the slide here, it captures the actions required to vote by mail, the most basic level. So unlike voting in person, these steps take additional planning and are spread across a long period of time. And even for those who will vote at polling places this year, the process can look different. Many polling locations will not be available, so voters will have to find out where they can vote, and then they'll need to figure out how and what to do to comply with safety procedures before casting a ballot. So all of these boxes and more offer opportunities for good design to help people vote in this unusual environment. So let me start with the first one. Registration. Getting people registered is always a major focus for turnout efforts. But this year in particular, special attention needs to be paid to getting people on the rolls and ensuring their information is up to date. Recent advances in registration, like automatic voter registration at DMVs, are unfortunately all but dried up. And in-person registration drives are non-existent. So to give a sense of the loss, nearly 45% of registration applications came from the DMV in 2018. That's a huge deficit to overcome. And then updated information is particularly important in this year, where we expect to see a record number of mail ballots. They need to be sent to the right address. So having the right information on voter rolls is paramount. So to meet the moment, we need to identify new ways of making registration salient to eligible voters. We need to identify how people are engaging with their communities differently in our current situation and adapt accordingly. So this can make registration pushes through new outreach channels like checking calls or through mutual aid groups one opportunity. We can also think about college students who are moving now to virtual education. So offering them timely and actionable registration information on learning portals, for example, can help reach new voters. And of course, offering registration opportunities at essential businesses can capture a large number of people. As proof of concept, we've seen promising results from our VoteR program, in which salient registration notifications are placed in hospital emergency rooms. While people wait, they can easily scan a QR code on their phone to go straight to a registration application. So these successes can hopefully be replicated at other essential locations, making these opportunities top of mind to millions more. All right, and then once people are registered, many states will still require them to proactively request an absentee ballot if they want to vote. Some states are going to send it out automatically. That's a good step, but I don't imagine that most will. So to support voters, we have to make sure these applications feel like a priority and that the process for applying isn't full of unnecessary hassles. One way of creating urgency around applying is by framing voting by mail as part of protecting one's health. People are rightly focused right now on staying safe and healthy and are open to recommendations that advance those goals. So this message can be pushed out through direct outreach or tied to places where people are already thinking about health outcomes, like states' COVID-19 websites or in pharmacies. But beyond intent, we have to recognize that the process can be particularly onerous when people are stuck at home. For that reason, offering voters options on how to apply and providing physical applications with prepaid return envelopes, like key areas and essential businesses, is key to increasing uptake. Because people may not have printers for wet signatures. People may not have stamps, and we need to make sure that we are removing those hurdles to make it as easy as possible. But our job's not done there. We can also help voters through the final step of the voting process in a range of ways. Because the process is so new and different to millions of people, efforts to familiarize voters with what's to come can pay huge dividends. This includes previewing next steps in the process, showing visual representations of mail balloting envelopes in advance so they're recognizable, and anticipating and clarifying frequent missteps. It would also help voters if we normalize the need for assistance. Voters may become discouraged and disheartened if they hit roadblocks in the process. So destigmatizing the learning curve can help reduce potential drop-off. And then finally, well-timed follow-up communications to people who have yet to submit their ballots can be a helpful nudge. But it needs to be done tactfully to not badger voters and disengage them. So one example I had here is a type of chaser postcard that we're thinking of designing, in which election offices send this out to people who have requested a ballot, received it, but have yet to return it in a timely way. The official seal can grab attention and signal importance. And then the content can be a useful reminder. Here we designed, on the flip side, a simple survey as a vehicle to also remind voters to return their ballots. The cover offered by the survey makes the nudge feel less directive and less condescending, but it delivers the point that the mail balloting deadline is coming up soon. All right, moving on to the next objective. It's crucial to give voters confidence in the systems they're engaging with. Many people have real doubts about flexible voting options because of certain priors or a misunderstanding of the different options. And when there's that kind of doubt, people's connection to our democratic system is diminished. They may decide not to vote because why bother if there's a good chance their vote won't get counted. For example, people may remember a lost piece of mail and question the reliability of USPS. Others may remember the recent do-over election in North Carolina that was triggered by someone illegally collecting and altering ballots. And of course, we just can't ignore the political climate. False claims about voter fraud serve to undermine the integrity of the elections. This isn't about politics, this is really about the integrity of our democratic system. Unfortunately, we've seen how sticky some of these misperceptions can be. Some common myths around mail voting that we've seen include votes not being counted except when elections are close, or that ballots mailed out in the world can be cast by anyone, or that someone could get away with voting twice, once by mail, once in person. But we can chip away at these myths and start building trust through good communication and good design. So borrowing a lesson from COVID-19, colleagues of mine at Ideas 42 put out a very helpful guide on effective public health messaging. And some of these principles poured over very nicely to our voting situation. Like, for example, not repeating the myth. In the voting space, it's really important to not say the myth over and again, because it just inculcates that in people's minds. We should instead control the narrative, not by debunking attacks, but by proactively communicating and demonstrating that voting is safe and secure. Election officials should also be explicit and consistent about how voting will change in November and tell voters the same message over and over again. And to make sure the message resonates, trusted messengers from the community should be recruited to amplify information that benefits voters. And finally, we should meet voters where they are and talk in a language and through frames that they care about, like the safety aspects associated with mail balloting. So these principles can help inform how communications go out to make sure that voters understand what's to come. But there are also ways to design systems to engender trust and confidence. So providing transparency into how the system works, showing who counts ballots, explaining how security is ensured can help all of us. So I want to show an example of using existing tools to improve trust in people's minds. So for instance, a growing number of jurisdictions are offering ballot tracking to voters. And slight changes can address some of the most pernicious concerns. Allowing voters to indicate back to election officials, for example, that a ballot is sent gives them a sense of control and oversight on ballots that are now out of their hands. Showing a counted step at the end of the process can reinforce that mail ballots will definitely be processed and added to the final results. So through small tweaks, we can signal really important information to voters. And these changes can add clarity and build confidence in unfamiliar systems. All right, so I just want to move on now to the third objective in the interest of time. We need to ensure equity and inclusion. So let's start by recognizing the conditions that are present in our current context. First, certain communities are being impacted disproportionately by public health crises. This makes health risk that much more acute for certain voters. Second, voting systems will be changing rapidly. Where typically there are pilots to expose inadvertent inequities, many jurisdictions will be implementing large changes for the first time in general elections. Finally, there are inherent equities in our system already, and those will carry forward into our elections. We have to get ahead of all three of these issues. So one way of increasing equitable access is by having safe and reasonably available in-person voting options. But election officials, we have to ask, are they able to do enough to protect voters' health? And will people trust that the precautions are enough? Are the risks going to feel much too great for them? Voters have a mental model of what polling places look like. Long lines, crowded voting areas that will need to be updated. Also, they may mistrust government's willingness to take necessary steps to take care of their health. I mean, after all, a lot of the disparities we're seeing in COVID-19 are due to previous failures in the equitable provisions of health. So to have people assume that in this case, officials are going to come through for them may be a tall order. So we have to think of ways to solve this in reality, but also in its perception. So one way to solve for this issue is that election officials can enlist community leaders to validate polling places ahead of elections. So inviting leaders and media to tour facilities ahead of time creates a chance for feedback, which is obviously very important, but also brings on trusted messengers that can reach wide audiences. Voters will know in advance this way that voting is safe and secure, and then not have to question it when they decide to go vote on election day or before. So having this, again, this is a matter of familiarizing people with what's to come, but also having outside lenses into how safety precautions may or may not be serving everybody. Officials will also need to actively root out opportunities for bias by reducing the individual discretion on whose vote counts. So looking at the signature verification process associated with mail ballots, the ACLU in Florida found that in 2016, Black and Hispanic voters had their ballots rejected in the state at rates that were more than double the rates of white voters. I mean, there's no way to put it except that this is a form of disenfranchisement. The Florida case may not be consistent across the country, but it is enough to give us pause and say, we should do more. Now, I want to recognize that it's easy to say we should do more, but signature matching is admittedly hard. The process takes a lot of training and a lot of discretion and skill, but it can be improved. But before I talk about how, let's take a quick diversion and see how good you are at matching signatures. So the last question for the group, can you determine which signature matches the one on the left? So I think, Mitra, now I figured out how to pull out the polls myself, so I'll just put it out.
Great.
All right, give people a few more seconds, and then I'll close this poll. Okay, I am impressed. You're all good verifiers. Let me first say thanks to Colorado for putting out a really great training manual that has a nice quiz at the end, which I stole this from. But as you can see, that if you're processing these extremely quickly and seeing a lot of signatures, it may be hard at times to match signatures. And I also want to recognize that there are confounding factors that may make it even harder. And that includes age, both in the fact that some people, as they get older, have a hard time signing their signature, but also young people tend not to sign their name that often. So the consistency across signatures may not be there. So what can we do? So we think we can improve the process through looking at both sides of the equation. First on the voter side, and then on the verifier side. On the voter side, we think we should explain the ways that the signatures are being used. A lot of times voters are asked to sign ballots with some legal terms around it, or some language that makes sure they notice that this is something that's required, but they don't understand why it's required or what it's going to be used for. So they may inadvertently do something that is relatively haphazard, not realizing that it may come back to bite them by having their ballot rejected. We can also offer multiple opportunities for voters to update their signatures. We see states sending out signature cards ahead of elections. For example, Hawaii has done this. and as a way of capturing the latest and most updated signature from people. Other states, though, use signatures that are on file that may have been on file for quite a while. For example, from people's driver's license signatures. And those may be out of sync with how people view their own signatures. So giving people the chance to update is always good practice. Finally, we have to, not finally, thirdly, we have to make sure that the importance of signatures is salient when it matters the most. So I mentioned the ballot envelope having language about why people must sign it. Well, that's a good time to deliver the message that it's going to be used in a certain way, because if not, then people may forget that their signature is important at the point when they're actually signing the card. And finally, if people's ballots do get rejected, there should be a simple ballot curing process. A lot of states don't have a ballot curing process at all. If ballots get rejected, voters are not notified and they don't have a chance to fix it. But that should change, and the states that are using curing process should have a way of getting voters the information that their ballot needs to be fixed and offer them multiple channels to do so, especially in an environment where we're staying at home and the normal avenues of fixing and curing ballots may not be available to people. But that's all on the voters' behavior side. I think it's important for us also to remove discretion where we can on the verifier side. So one thing that I think is really important is to recognize that fraud and abuse of mail balloting is extremely, extremely, extremely rare. For elections officials, nobody wants to be so permissible that they allow fraud in the door, and the optics of that is quite high, or quite problematic. So the downside risks feel very high. But I think it's fair for verifiers to presume that signatures are valid and start at that reference point when they're determining whether or not there's a match. That frame can help people figure out whether or not a signature should go through or whether or not they should reject it out of hand. Next, we have to improve the first pass from automated systems. Right now, there's about a 30-35% hit rate with automated systems before they go to a human verifier in states that have that. That could be improved if we had more data points for comparison. These systems are limited by the information they have. So giving verifiers more signatures to compare to, that may be a policy or legislative fix, is one important area to improve upon, but also having more signatures on file by giving voters a chance to provide those signatures is another important opportunity. So we are looking at designs of ways of making it, giving voters a chance when they get cards sent out to them to sign the card multiple times in a way that doesn't seem confusing, but offers multiple data points for these automated systems. If it does come to a verifier, it's really important to hide voter information unless this signature is rejected twice. And the reason we say this is the voter's information is sometimes provided to allow the verifier to look at whether there are circumstances that may lead to signatures not matching. For example, I mentioned people as they get older may have their signatures change slightly because of their dexterity. But having that information can also allow biases to seep in that could lead to unintended consequences that are problematic. So if you have a signature that's rejected, verifiers can come back after the fact and make sure that there aren't circumstances about who the voter is that may justify that. And then finally, conducting real-time audits on verifiers is a really important step to make sure that if you have some that are rejecting voters at higher rates, they are identified and training can be put into place. We assume there's going to be some variety between verifiers, but having spikes can indicate that there may be issues with how that person is, how permissible that person is, or what biases that may be put in place. Great. So those are the three areas that we're looking at. Those are just a smattering of some of the ideas that we have in place. We're going to have a whole bunch more, but I want to recognize that we're talking a lot about how we're applying the behavioral lens, but in reality, this is an all hands on deck process. We need to help election officials, we need to help voters get ready for November. And that requires organizations from NGOs to the federal government, to academia, to the media, to organizers all to play a role in helping our country get ready and be resilient for the elections to come. Otherwise, we'll be caught flat-footed and we'll have to deal with the fallout, which will be much, much, much worse. So what are we doing next? I mentioned that we are developing more recommendations. We're actually going to be packaging them soon in something that is much more actionable and digestible for people who are in the field, whether they are election officials or voting innovators, to take some of these insights and put them into practice. We'll also work directly with state and local officials to implement voter-centric policies. They have a ton on their plate. I mentioned the logistical challenges alone are nightmarish, but we can't ignore the voter experience, and we're hopefully going to be able to help them focus on that in an easy way. And then lastly, we're hopefully going to conduct direct voter outreach to encourage turnout in November. So a lot of the insights that we demonstrated can be done through outreach from third parties, and we want to make sure that we are doing that to encourage people to take up the different steps of the voting process, especially the mail balloting process, to make sure that they are completing the most safe and secure way of voting. We have a lot of this information on our website. We're going to have more and build it out even further. I highly recommend that you sign up for our mailing list, go to our website often and see these things as they are populating. And always happy to have conversations with people as this continues. So I wanted to make sure that we had a sufficient amount of time for Q&A because I saw a lot of questions come in. But I just want to say before I open it up for questions that this is going to be an election for the history books. I don't think anybody can doubt that people are going to be looking back at 2020 and voting during a pandemic at a time where we have a lot of barriers stopping people from voting in traditional ways. I really hope that when we look back at this time, it's not going to be a case study in what went wrong, but instead a case study in how we have all come together to do things that are right and how we have helped voters and officials complete a very, very difficult task and protect our democracy. All right, so with that very swelling note, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you, Omar. So we'll give everybody a little bit of time to drop some questions in related to the presentation overall. There is one question from earlier on in your deck, and it related to the map that you displayed early on. I think it was in regards to nobody winning. Is there a specific key to the map that you can walk everyone through while we're waiting for broader questions to come in?
Absolutely, and I apologize for not having the key. I wanted to make the map itself as big as possible. Just one moment, April. All right, so the key is that the different counties that are presented here that are in black are the ones where there were more people who did not vote than voted for either Trump or Clinton. And then in the ones that are blue, it goes for Clinton, and the ones that are red are Trump. Obviously, this is not normalized for population size, but it just shows very starkly how there's a lot of black on the map. So in most jurisdictions here, the number of people who did not vote outnumbered the people who voted for either of the candidates. And I should give credit for the map to Jim Harriers and Phil Kearney. Jim Harriers.
Great, thank you. So I've got a starter question here while we wait for more questions to come in. What angle should election administrators take to promoting vote by mail so that it's not political? Health and safety, ease, guarding our democracy, any other types of angles they should be considering?
Yeah, and I appreciate that question, Mitra. I think at the end of the day, it's a very easy case to make that voting by mail is not a political approach to voting for a couple of reasons. Number one, it has been in place since the Civil War. There's a long history of voting by mail, and it's a way of protecting a fundamental right in our Constitution, and that is a democracy by the people and for the people. Ensuring that people have a chance to vote is not a political thing. It should be the core tenet of how we think about our government and civic participation in this country. But beyond that, there are people who worry that allowing people to vote more easily will encourage one party to have more favor than the other in terms of the results. And what we've seen, there was a recent study that came out last month that showed that there is no partisan benefit to vote by mail. One recent example we can point to is the election that just happened in California. That was a mail balloting election that was being derided, but ultimately the Republican won the seat, and beating not the incumbent, but the incumbent was a Democrat. So clearly, this is not something that favors the Democratic Party more than the Republican Party, and it's something that should be seen as benefiting all Americans.
Great. It's an interesting question, which I think will be familiar to you, because young people as a demographic are always dealt with as a separate group, and so if we're talking about vote by mail, are there any specific ideas to make vote by mail through the Postal Service easier to adopt for younger people who, especially in this day and age, might not be as familiar with how the Postal Service functions?
Yeah, no, that's a very fair question, and one that's complicated even further by the fact that a lot of students are no longer going physically to university. We see this problem with the census, for example, where students don't know where to count their residency because they may live in some city, go to university in a different city, and that city may be in a different state. Voting is complicated even further by the fact that each state has their own requirements and ways of determining how people vote, but students should be able to vote at the universities they go to. But now if they're home, they may have registered in a state that they're no longer eligible to vote in or willing to vote in. So if we think about mailing them ballots, we need to first make sure they have the right address. So reaching them at touch points that are salient to them is the first and foremost approach, where we need to make sure we're getting the message out to people to put their correct address on their registration form. But then we have to also look at alternatives to USPS. We talked about mail balloting briefly here, but ballot drop-offs. There are ways to put ballot drop boxes in places where they'll be really accessible to young people that are in population areas where they have a large number of young people, and they can easily drop off their ballot. But then on top of that, if that's not available, people should be able to vote by mail as simply as possible. So states like Washington have required now prepaid postage on envelopes that are returned with a ballot, so that people don't have to find stamps. We've seen time and again that stamps is a legitimate barrier to a lot of young people who just don't send mail. It sounds silly, but it's real. And I don't think it's that surprising when you think about how they engage with the postal system. It's just not necessarily in their purview.
Great. I mean, so taking that a step further and also thinking about security concerns, what do you think about voting online and just going around the physical hassles altogether?
Thanks for that, Mitra. I don't know who's necessarily on the call, so hopefully I won't say something that'll upset others. But if I do say something, please put it into the chat, your objections. I'm a little nervous about voting online. We're seeing jurisdictions do pilot programs. Like, for example, parts of Delaware and New Jersey are now doing some online voting. It has legitimate security concerns in the sense that providing encrypted systems that cannot be hacked is a very, very difficult thing to do. And again, margin for error is zero. We cannot have a situation where a single vote is hacked. So there's very smart people out there who are doing great work in ensuring the security of online voting. But what worries me beyond just the actual logistics of voting online is the misinformation that can come out of that. So we already see that people try to, trick voters is the best way to put it, telling them that they can vote online, only for people to find out on election day, when maybe it's too late to do anything else, that they actually cannot. And then there's a lot of misinformation around fraud through online voting. And that, again, erodes people's trust and confidence in our electoral system. So having the seeds of these election systems or online voting be out there, it can add a little bit more fuel to those myths in a way that may spiral a bit out of control.
Great. So you've mentioned a lot of different problems that are being worked on across the country, I think across various platforms. Do you happen to know roughly how many jurisdictions in the United States are actively working on trying to solve various problems that you've listed?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, Mitra, because I do want to give a lot of credit where credit is due. I think nearly every jurisdiction is taking this extremely seriously and trying to figure out ways of helping voters vote safely and easily. There are sometimes hurdles are in place because of politics. Legislative bodies are not passing policies that are supportive of their election officials. And then there are also logistical and cost hurdles that people need to overcome. I think we are seeing states take this seriously early, which is really good, because this is not something we can plan for midsummer. The planning has to have happened already. We see states like California take really proactive steps in bringing in a lot of stakeholders to talk through what changes to the voting system could look like, what are some broad recommendations, and then implementing those recommendations in a very clear and consistent way. States like Michigan are doing some phenomenal work around reforming their electoral system. They are bolstered by some electoral reform policies that were passed in 2018 by the voters directly, and now are thinking through even more, how do we make sure that the state is responsive to the needs of voters, and that the many, many local election officials have the tools they need to serve voters properly. So around the country, we're seeing great examples of innovation. And I picked on Wisconsin a little bit, but I actually need to highlight how amazing a lot of local election officials have been, and how hamstrung they were by just the politics in the state. So for example, we saw in Milwaukee, I believe, the libraries turned their book drop-off stations into ballot drop-off stations, which was a really smart and helpful way of helping process and send back a lot of mail ballots. So innovation is out there. I'm very impressed and heartened by what's going on, but I do feel like these election administrators need a lot of support as well.
Great. So I know that the landscape has changed a lot since the midterm election in multiple ways, obviously, but are there some results from past experiments of Ideas 42s that were successful in increasing turnout that you can share with everyone?
Sure. Yeah, we had several really clever experiments that went out in the midterms of 2018. And just to remind people, that was a midterm that had record turnout. I think it was the highest in almost a century. And yet we were able to help boost that even further with some of our interventions. So, for example, we worked very closely with TurboVote to think through how to use digital messaging to reach their very broad audience, and get them to take up ballots through some social accountability, so through some norming language, etc. And we have actually a brief on our website if people want to read more about those specific interventions. We also worked very closely with Minnesota through the Secretary of State's office to send out mailers to people who were first-time voters in 2016. So what we were doing there was recognizing that people tend to vote at higher rates in presidential elections and in midterms. So we reached out to those people who voted in 2016 and were registered for the first time, and indicated to them that they're already off to a great start and not to mess up their streak. And set the mental model that being a good voter is voting every 2 years, not just every presidential election. And that simple message had a statistical impact on turnout, statistically significant impact. So we think that there is room there to give people information and deepen the meaning around what voting should look like.
Great. So switching topics a little bit, this is another great question. Do you perceive a significant degree of risk in disclosing issues of signature-related ballot rejection to voters potentially completing mail-in ballots?
Yes, absolutely. So there could be a backfire effect where if people feel like rejection rates are high or even existent, people may feel like they don't want to vote by mail because it's too high of a risk. We see how people like to minimize risk to extreme extents. Zero risk bias is a real thing, and we see people go out and buy a whole bunch of toilet paper because they don't want to have the risk of running out during this time of crisis. So there could be a backfire where people see that some ballots are rejected and they decide instead they're going to vote in person or not vote at all. What I think we can do is communicate to people the importance of signatures without emphasizing the rejection rate, and actually give them confidence that the system is put into place to protect their security and protect their vote. And if anything goes wrong, there is recourse for them to correct any mistakes. It's a very delicate needle to thread, but I think there's a way of messaging it to avoid any sort of backlash.
Speaking of delicate, what do you think of the use of social pressure to increase turnout? Do you think that sending voters their voting grades goes too far?
Again, I don't know who's on the call, so I want to be careful about being too critical. I am nervous about heavy-handed social pressure. I think the person who's writing the question is likely referencing some really powerful experiments done in previous election where people were shown their voting record and how it compared to others in their peer group or their neighbors. And sure enough, it had an impact on turnout at an extremely high rate, something like 8 percentage points higher turnout for people who received it. But it also made people really angry. And I don't think that's how we want people to engage with the democratic system. I don't think we want people to feel like it is an adversarial process. There are ways of applying social pressure without having that same sort of backlash. So I talked about that Minnesota example about showing people that they voted in 2016 and they shouldn't lose their streak. Well, part of our messaging was to congratulate people for voting, but also subtly indicate that we'll know if you didn't vote in 2018. So there's some accountability and pressure, but with a positive spin that hopefully will encourage them to vote, as opposed to discourage them from engaging because they have a bad taste in their mouth.
Great. So we are coming up on the end of the hour, and I think that that is a good note to close out on. So I want to thank you, Omar, for sharing such illuminating insights about what is a critical issue that is surely on all of our minds as we prepare for November, and thank all of our participants for the excellent engaging questions and for taking some time out of your busy day to hear from Ideas 42. We will be sending a recording of this session to you in the coming days. And if you do have any lingering questions for Omar and the rest of our civic engagement team, please feel free to reach out to us at academy@ideas42.org, and we can keep that conversation going. Just a plug for the Academy generally, our next seminar series will be June 18th, and it will focus on design principles for clearing the pathway to college. And if you're interested in learning more about the fundamental principles of behavioral science and how to start thinking about applying it in your work, our next crash course in behavioral science will be taking place entirely remotely from June 8th to 11th, and we have a few spots left. And as ever, you can find out more information about all of our Academy offerings at ideas42.org/academy. And of course, as Omar had mentioned, in his presentation, one of the other resources that Ideas 42 has developed for the COVID pandemic is increasing the efficacy and impact of communications. We have developed more resources of this nature, which we've put together in an index page that you can apply to your work during this unfortunate time of crisis, and good rules of thumb for all effective communications at ideas42.org/COVID-19. Thank you again, Omar, and thank you to all of you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.